Okay, so we've learned about industrialism and urbanization and all the negative effects that go along with that. Now we need to learn about progressivism, which is pretty much how society and then eventually the government respond to all of the ills created by the industrial era. And that's actually something that comes up as a quiz question and eventually on the Regents exam as well, is that the term progressivism is very simply defined as attempts to fix the ills, and I put that in quotes, a very important word, of industrialism. So that's the basic definition of progressivism. It'll pop up on the Regents exam worded almost exactly that same way. Here we go. The attempt to bring under control the problems created by industrial growth and change. Now, a conservative view is that business should be free to compete without regulations from the government, and that would be the term we've already learned at this point, laissez-faire. The progressive view, on the other hand, is that it was time to abandon laissez-faire. They supported laws that would stop unfair business practices, first of all, but also provide protection for consumers and the general public from the unpleasant effects of industrialism, and we'll learn some specific examples in this slideshow of how this was attempted to be achieved. Some progressive presidents and their legacy from all the way back in the early 1900s to today. Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912, and he instituted, through Congress as well as him signing into law, the graduated income tax. Franklin D. Roosevelt, during the Great Depression, established the Social Security system, which is simply income in your later years. And it was because the elderly were suffering in larger amounts than the rest of society because they were no longer working. And when the Depression hit, some of them lost everything they had and were suffering a lot more than everyone else. So he established Social Security. In the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson establishes Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is medical care for the elderly, and Medicaid is medical care for the poor. And today, President Obama has instituted, again with laws being passed through Congress but signed into law by himself, is healthcare reform. It was one of the things that he campaigned for the presidency on and took the most significant action with during his presidency. Now, opposition to progressivism. Famous German economist Eugen Baumritter von Bauer. He is very, very, very pro-capitalism, believes that the creation of wealth in capitalism benefits all of society, not just those that are becoming extremely rich. A guy that's not really well known, Bill Benson, he tried to find a loophole to have the 16th Amendment thrown out. That is what established the graduated income tax. Ronald Reagan, our 40th president, establishes supply-side economics, also known as Reaganomics, in which the government gives tax breaks to businesses that lowers their costs, allows them to hire more people. So yes, the businesses are getting more profits out of it, but the theory is that people getting jobs because firms are hiring will also benefit the average person. And then Representative Ron Paul of the House of Representatives wanted to return to the gold standard throughout his time in Congress. He is now retired, but he believed that our monetary system was becoming increasingly fragile and that we needed to return to the gold standard to make sure that our money was very strong. Labor unions. We already learned about the rise of labor, but labor unions began during the Progressive era to push beyond just safety and conditions of the workplace, and they pushed more for better wages. Some states even began enacting a minimum wage, and also fair hours. Most states had an 8 or 10 hour limit after the Progressive era, and labor unions in the Progressive era pushing for that. Two famous Supreme Court cases that deal with working hours. Lochner versus New York, right here in New York State. A New York State law said that bakers could not work more than 10 hours a day and or 60 hours a week. The Supreme Court, however, overturns the law, saying that violated a business owner's right to life, liberty, and property, and that the law limited their rights to their property without due process of law. To sum that up, it essentially meant that you can't tell, especially a family-owned bakery or an individual just on their own owned bakery, you can't tell them how long they can or can't work. So this was actually overturned by the Supreme Court. And here is a political cartoon. The Supreme Court thinks that your health is not affected by how many hours you work. And the baker says, well, that notion seems pretty half-baked. It's meant to be funny. You guys probably just think I'm cheesy. Also, Muller versus Oregon, much more known even than Lochner versus New York. In 1908, an Oregon law provided that women could not work more than 10 hours a day in factories and laundries. Lawyer Louie Brown, who eventually, by the way, becomes a Supreme Court justice, defends the law in front of the Supreme Court and had it upheld. So this is very different than Lochner versus New York because the limited working hours law was upheld in this case. He used scientific studies of the effects long hours had on women's health as evidence, and this was enough to convince the court to side with him. And to quote the 14th Amendment here, no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So this was the justification used in the Lochner versus New York case, as the business owners were supposedly being denied these rights, but it was also used by Louie Brown to say, well, the worker is being denied life, liberty, and property because of the extensive number of hours they had to work just to survive. This is Louie Brown, who eventually becomes an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court a few years after arguing this case, Muller v. Oregon, and he served from 1916 to 1939. So the middle class and newspapers. Throughout the industrial era, the middle class grew larger and larger. Progressives had the support of the working class, so the lower classes that are struggling, but they need the support of the middle class in order to advance their agenda. And the best way in this time period to reach the middle class was to utilize the newspaper media. This term yellow journalism, it's much more significant when dealing with U.S. involvement in the Spanish-American War, which we haven't learned about yet. We will in the next unit. But in general, yellow journalism means writing about a scandal and or sensationalizing an issue to attract attention. This term, yellow journalism, comes from the Progressive era, and progressives used the newspaper media as an opportunity to get their message to the middle class. Many famous authors from this period contributed to the progressive movement using these very tactics. And the people who did so become known as muckrakers. If you write about dirty politicians, which would be like the muck, the mud, the nastiness that you're dealing with, they're called muckrakers by Theodore Roosevelt. Some examples. Lincoln Steffens writes a book, The Shame of the Cities, and it reveals how corrupt city politics is in most cities. So people like Boss Tweed, who had firm control of New York City politics. Ida Tarbell's History of the Standard Oil Company, which publicly bashes monopolist business practices and focuses particularly on John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. And then Upton Sinclair, perhaps the most famous example, writes The Jungle. And he exposes the disgusting conditions in Chicago meatpacking plants, with things like rats falling into the meat grinders and just allowing it to be ground up and sold with the meat. This led to government legislation to protect consumers against those things. And here you go. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Pure Food and Drug Act banned impure foods and drugs and required clearly labeled foods and drugs. And then the Meat Inspection Act gave U.S. officials the power to check the quality of meats shipped in interstate commerce. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is created as a result of the Pure Food and Drug Act, and a agriculture department already existed, but a branch of the USDA is what eventually is formed because of the Meat Inspection Act. Women's rights gains some serious traction during the Progressive era to the point where the 19th Amendment in 1919 and fully instituted in the 1920 elections gives women the right to vote. There's much more going on than that, though, because yes, you had Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, and Carrie Chapman Catt. They all are fighting for a woman's right to vote. Another woman, very well known, she publishes a book called What Every Girl Should Know, and she is trying to promote the idea of birth control. Margaret Sanger comes up with this movement to teach women about birth control because so many people are living in poverty in this time that it's hard to take care of your children. So she wants to teach women birth control so that if they don't desire kids or feel that they can't care for kids, they would have the option to plan ahead and not have children. Black rights, Booker T. Washington and Webb Du Bois. They have very differing opinions, but they fought for black rights through the NAACP. Booker T. Washington thought that blacks should really focus on just advancing themselves economically and making better lives for themselves, and not worry so much right away anyway about political rights. That eventually that would come once they had enough of an economic and social influence in the country. Webb Du Bois, however, was much more of the school of thought that you should, yes, try to advance yourself economically, but fight for political rights at the same time. Ida B. Wells, she is well known for leading the anti-lynching movement. She writes many articles in the editorial sections of newspapers. She writes a whole book, and it's all about the prevalence of lynching against blacks in the South. And she really leads this movement almost single-handedly to try to battle the fact that blacks were being lynched for attempting to fight for their rights. And lastly, Frances Willard and Carrie Nation. This is Frances Willard. This is Carrie Nation. Make note of her acts. Frances Willard and Carrie Nation fought alcohol abuse by lobbying to outlaw alcohol altogether. Not limit it, completely prohibit it, and that's where the term prohibition comes from. Carrie Nation actually became famous for destroying saloons with her hatchet. She sometimes would ride her horse right into the entryway and into the taverns and saloons and bust up whiskey and beer barrels as her form of protest. Eventually, the 18th Amendment is passed in 1919, but repealed in 1933 because it contributed to organized crime. Al Capone came to power in Chicago simply because he was making all of his money bootlegging illegal alcohol. So prohibition was simply just not manageable by the government, but the temperance and prohibition movement did gain enough traction to have the 18th Amendment passed in 1919. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure to go back to the web page and take the online quiz. Please use your notes. Go through the questions carefully and use your notes. If you use your notes, there's really no reason why you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.